The ethical basis of business is integrity, an ethical aspect that unites both private morality and public and professional ethics. Good day everyone, good day ma'am. I'm Elaiza Taculod from BSHM3B, and right now I'm going to report to Chapter 3 of the book The Philippine Tourism Law, entitled Law on Obligation and Contracts. We have here the learning objectives. First is to identify the different kinds of obligation and contracts. Second is enumerate the ways of extinguishing an obligation. And third is enumerate possible application of contracts in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry. Chapter 2, the Philippine Constitution. The law. A person desiring to engage in a business in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry will meet certain obligations. Agreements arising from contracts will have to be made, and potential breach from these agreements will be encountered. Therefore, there is a need to study the fundamental principles involving law on obligations and contracts. Obligations. Article 1156. An obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. We have here the discussion of the law. An obligation is a legal duty, however created, the violation of which may become the basic of an action law. Every obligation has 4 definite elements, without which the obligation can exist to will. First is an active subject, also known as obligee or creditor, who has the power to demand the prestation. 2 is a passive subject, also known as the debtor, who is bound to perform the prestation. And third is an object or the prestation, which is an object or undertaking to give, to do, or not to do. Fourth is the juridical or legal tie, the vinculum which binds the contracting parties, and the juridical tie or vinculum is based on the sources of obligation arising from either the law or contract. It is important to identify the prestation in a certain obligation. Once the prestation is identified, you can determine who the passive subject is, whom the active subject can demand fulfillment of the obligation. So the following are the obligations of the passive subject end. First is obligations to give a determinate thing. Second is obligation to do. Obligations to give a determined thing is to deliver the thing which has obligated himself to give, to take care of the thing with the proper diligence of a good father of a family, to deliver all its accessories and accessions, to pay damages in case of breach of obligation. Obligations to do. If the debtor fails to do what he is obliged to do it will be done at his expense. If the work is done in contravention of the tenor of obligation, it will be redone at debtor's expense. And if the work is poorly done, it will be redone at debtor expense. So we have here the sources of liability for damages of a party in an obligation are as follows. So first is fraud. The fraud is incidental fraud, doli indecente, which is fraud incident to the performance of an obligation. In fraud, there is intent to evade the normal fulfillment of the obligation and cause damage. Second is negligence. The negligence referred here in the case of contracts, common career is culpa contractual, the lack of diligence or carelessness. Negligence consists in the omission of the diligence which is required by the nature of the obligation and corresponds with the circumstances of the persons or the time and of the place. The third is we have here the delay or mora. The debtor can be held liable for the delay or default in the fulfillment of his obligation only after the creditor has made a demand, judicial or extrajudicial, on the debtor, except when the law expressly provides that demand is not necessary, when the contract expressly stipulates that demand is not necessary, when time is of the essence, when demand would be useless. Fourth is the contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Performance in the contravention of the tenor or terms of the obligations means where performance is contrary to what is agreed upon or stipulated as making the debtor liable for damages. We have here Article 1157, obligations arise from law, contracts, quasi-contracts, acts or omissions punishable by law, and quasi-delects. There are only 2 sources of obligations, namely law and contracts, because obligations arising from quasi-contract crimes, number 4 Article 1157 Civil Code of the Philippines, and quasi-delects are really imposed by law. A contract is a meeting of the minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. A quasi-contract refers to a lawful, voluntary, and unilateral act based on the maxim that no one shall unjustly enrich himself at the expense of another. Next, as we have here, the quasi-contract refers to a lawful, voluntary, and unilateral act based on the maxim that no one shall unjustly enrich himself at the expense of another. The two common forms of quasi-contract are solutio indebiti, which is payment by mistake, and negotiorum gestio, which takes place when a person without the consent of the owner assumes the management of an abandoned business. We have here also the civil obligations arising from criminals offense are governed by the provisions of the Revisal Penal Code, restitution, reparation of the damage caused, indemnification of consequential damages, and by the provisions of the Civil Code on damages, moral, exemplary, and nominal damages. Fourth is we have here the quasi-delict, also called culpa achilleana, is any act or omission which causes damage to another, there being fault or negligence, and there being no pre-existing contractual relation between the parties. So we have here the sample case. Application of the law. Annabelle was crossing the street coming from the hotel to the nearby shopping mall. She was accidentally hit by a hotel car driven by Leandro, a driver employed by the hotel. Can Annabelle sue the driver, or can she sue the hotel? We have here also the legal opinion. Yes, Annabelle may sue the driver and the hotel for damages on the ground of culpa achilleana. The pedestrian may also sue the driver and the owner of the hotel for damages for reckless imprudence arising from a crime under the Revisal Penal Code. So we have here also the classification of obligations. So first is we have the primary classification of obligations under the Civil Code. We have the pure and conditional obligations, obligations with a period, alternative and facultative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, divisible and indivisible obligations, obligations with a penal clause. And secondary classification of obligations under the Civil Code, we have also unilateral and bilateral obligations, real and personal obligations, civil and natural obligations, legal, conventional, and penal obligations. So we have here the modes of extinguishing obligations. Article 1231, obligations are extinguished by payment or performance, by the loss of the thing due, by the condonation or remission of the debt, by the confusion or merger of the rights of the creditor and debtor, by compensation, and by novation. Other causes of extinguishment of obligations, such as annulment, rescission, fulfillment of a resolutory condition, and prescription, are governed elsewhere in this Code 11568. There are other causes of extinguishment of obligation, which are not expressly provided under the above provision. Debt extinguishes obligations which are purely personal in character, such as partnership and agency. Obligations may also be extinguished by the happenings of fortuitous event or by will of one of the parties, as in some contracts such as partnership and agency. Next is we have also the contracts. Article 1305, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. The essential elements of a contract are as follows. First is consent, which is manifested by the meeting of the minds of the offer and acceptance upon the thing and the cause which are to constitute the contract. The offer must be certain and the acceptance absolute. Object certain, which is the subject matter of the contract and the cause of the obligation which is established. So we have here some guide questions. Try to answer the following questions to give you a better understanding of the laws discussed in this chapter. So first is what are the different kinds of obligations? Second is what is the difference between fraud and negligence? And that's the end of my report. Thank you and have a good day.